The morning light seeped weakly through the thin curtains, casting a pale glow across the cramped, chilly room. She lay there for a moment, eyes open, staring at the ceiling with a hollow stillness. Her stomach cramped and growled in protest, but she was used to ignoring it by now. She turned her head slowly and looked at her son, curled up under a threadbare blanket, breathing softly, his tiny hands clutching the fabric like a lifeline. She hated waking him. She hated what waking up meant these days. Carefully, she slid out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold, cracked floor. In the small kitchen, she opened the cabinet and found what she expected, almost nothing. A broken cracker at the bottom of an empty bag and half a glass of water left in the chipped pitcher. She stared at them for a long moment. There would be no breakfast, not really. But a child could not wake up to nothing. She set the cracker on a small plate and poured the water into a clean mug to make it look like something more than it was. As she worked, she could hear the faint shifting of her son waking up. His voice, small and scratchy, reached her ears like a dagger to the heart. "Mommy, is it morning already?" She forced a smile onto her face as she turned to him. "Yes, sweetheart, come sit down." He rubbed his eyes and shuffled to the table, his face lighting up at the sight of the plate. It didn't matter that it was barely anything. It was something. He picked up the cracker delicately, like it was a treasure, and bit into it with an exaggerated mmm sound that broke her heart even more. She sipped the water, pretending it was coffee, pretending they were just having a light breakfast because it was Saturday, or a holiday, or any other reason except the truth. He looked up at her, crumbs on his lips, and asked with innocent seriousness, "Will we have lunch today, Mommy?" She felt her throat tighten painfully, but she nodded with the same lie she told herself every morning. "Of course, baby. We'll have something nice later." She didn't know what. She didn't know how. But she couldn't let him see the fear that gnawed at her even harder than the hunger. After he finished his meager breakfast, she helped him get dressed in his worn-out jacket, patched and too thin for the creeping cold outside. She bundled herself in a sweater that had lost its shape long ago and tied her scarf tight around her neck. She stood in the doorway for a moment, holding his hand, gathering the courage to step outside. She had an idea, a desperate, humiliating idea. The neighborhood school was just a few streets away. Maybe, just maybe, there would be leftover food from the cafeteria. Maybe someone would understand. Maybe someone would help. She couldn't remember the last time she had asked for anything. She was the kind of woman who handled things alone, who kept her struggles private, who wore pride like armor. But hunger had a way of stripping everything away, layer by layer, until even dignity became a luxury she could no longer afford. Her son looked up at her with bright eyes, trusting and unaware, and she squeezed his little hand harder. She would walk to that school. She would swallow whatever shame rose up in her throat. For him, she would do anything. The streets were still wet from the night's rain, and the sky threatened another downpour. She walked quickly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The school loomed ahead, a simple building with peeling paint and a sagging chain-link fence. She had passed it 100 times before, always on the other side of the gate, never thinking she would one day walk up to it like this, desperate and small. She adjusted the scarf around her neck and took a deep breath. Her son tugged at her sleeve. "Are we going to school, Mommy?" he asked. She smiled again, that same fragile, cracking smile. "Just for a little while, love, just to ask something." At the entrance, she hesitated. Her feet felt glued to the pavement, but she pushed forward, stepping into the small administrative office that smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper. A woman sat behind a desk, tapping on a computer with an air of bored detachment. The mother approached slowly, clearing her throat to catch the woman's attention. The secretary glanced up with mild annoyance, then motioned for her to wait. She stood there, shifting from foot to foot, feeling every second stretch out unbearably long. Her son leaned against her leg, looking around curiously. Finally, the woman spoke without warmth. "Can I help you?" The mother swallowed hard, her mouth dry. I was wondering if there might be any leftover food from the cafeteria for my son." The words felt like acid in her mouth. The secretary stared at her for a moment, then picked up the phone and made a quick call, muttering something unintelligible. Minutes later, the principal emerged from a side door. A woman in a stiff blazer and sharp heels, her face set in a hard, impassive mask. The mother repeated her request, quieter this time, almost whispering. She hated herself for how small her voice sounded. The principal listened, arms crossed, then shook her head slowly, a cold smile curling on her lips. "It is not the school's job to feed mothers and their children," she said, each word slicing through the room like a blade. "If you need assistance, you should contact the proper services." She turned on her heel and walked away before the mother could even reply. The secretary went back to her computer as if nothing had happened. No one looked at her. No one cared. The mother stood there for a few seconds longer, feeling a heat rise up her neck that had nothing to do with the air. She nodded once mechanically and turned around. Her son, sensing the shift in her mood, grabbed her hand tighter. Without a word, they stepped back into the gray morning, the door clicking shut behind them like the closing of a final, unbreakable barrier. As they walked away from the school, her son looked up at her and asked, "Will there be breakfast tomorrow, Mommy?" His voice was so soft, so full of trust, that it felt like her heart physically broke in her chest. She looked down at him and smiled once more, the smile that cost her everything, and said, "Of course, baby. Of course there will." Inside, she had no answer at all. The walk back home felt longer than the one to the school, though the distance was the same. Every step echoed with a heavier weight, not just from the physical exhaustion, but from the shame that clung to her. Like a second skin, she kept her head down, watching the cracks in the sidewalk blur as her vision wavered. Her son clutched her hand tightly, sensing her unease but saying nothing. The cold wind nipped at their faces, turning their cheeks red and chapping their lips. But they walked on in silence, surrounded by the unseen noise of a city that had long stopped noticing people like them. She could still hear the principal's voice in her mind, cold and dismissive, as if her plea had been something offensive, something embarrassing to even acknowledge. It wasn't just the refusal, it was the way she had been looked at, or rather not looked at, like she wasn't even worth basic human kindness. Hunger was a cruel thing, but humiliation could cut even deeper. She wished she had never gone. She wished she had stayed hidden, in the cramped safety of their small apartment where, at least her pride had a place to breathe. As they passed rows of old buildings, the mother glimpsed windows lit with warm yellow light, families sitting at tables, plates full of food, laughter drifting faintly through the cold air. She pulled her son closer to her side and picked up her pace. She didn't want him to see. She didn't want him to compare. He deserved more than this, but she had nothing left to give. The small hope she had carried with her to the school, that morning fragile and desperate, had been crushed without ceremony. Now there was only the gnawing emptiness of what to do next. They turned onto their street, a narrow alley lined with sagging houses and broken fences. Their apartment building was a squat, grimy block that smelled of mold and rust, but it was a roof, and it was theirs for now. Climbing the steps, she felt every ache in her body complain, but she ignored it. Inside, the air was stale and cold. She helped her son take off his jacket, hung it carefully by the door, and told him to go wash his hands. As he ran off to the bathroom, she stood in the middle of the small living room, arms hanging limply at her sides. She didn't move for a long time. She just stood there, listening to the tiny sounds of her son splashing water, the old pipes, groaning, the faint hum of a neighbor's television through the paper-thin walls. She thought about calling someone, maybe the church, maybe a shelter. But the thought of saying it all out loud again, The thought of another voice telling her no, telling her she should have done better, made her stomach twist in knots. She had done everything she could, every job she could find, every sacrifice she could make, every resource stretched to breaking. She had done it all. But the world didn't care. The world didn't see her. The world didn't even bother to say, "No," kindly. Her son emerged from the bathroom, face damp and smiling. He asked if he could watch cartoons, and she nodded. She wanted to say more. She wanted to fill the silence with reassurance, with promises she was terrified she could not keep, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she busied herself with straightening up the few belongings they had, pretending to be occupied, pretending everything was normal. In the kitchen, she opened the fridge out of habit, even though she already knew what was inside. A shriveled apple, a slice of bread that had gone hard, and a small carton of milk that had long since passed its date. She closed the door softly, resting her forehead against the cool metal for a moment. She needed a plan. She needed to find something, anything, before morning. She considered going back to the school after hours, digging through the dumpsters, if she had to. She had heard of people doing that. She had judged them once, silently, from the safety of her ignorance. Now she was beginning to understand just how thin the line was between judgment and desperation. She wasn't there yet, but the edge was closer than she dared to admit. One more day, one more failure, and she could fall over it without even noticing. Her son called out to her from the living room, asking if they could have popcorn later. It was their little tradition, their special treat on the weekends when she had a few extra coins to spare. She closed her eyes for a moment, biting down hard on her lip to keep from crying. "Of course, baby," she called back, her voice bright and false. Later. She would find a way. She had to. The sky outside darkened as evening approached. She sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. People hurried past, bundled in warm coats, carrying grocery bags, laughing into their phones. She watched them the way a starving person watches a feast they are forbidden to touch. She wondered if any of them had ever been this hungry, if any of them had ever knocked on a door and been turned away not with anger, but with indifference. Somehow the indifference hurt more. In the growing darkness, she made a silent vow. Tomorrow would be different, somehow. She would find a way to get food. She would not let her son go hungry again. She had begged once today and been denied. She would not beg again. If the world had closed its doors to them, she would find another way. She would fight, quietly, stubbornly, without waiting for permission or pity. Tomorrow, she would walk again. Further if she had to. Longer if she must. Because the door might have closed, but her love for her son was still wide open, fierce, and unbreakable. And that was something no one could take away from her. The next morning came with a dull, gray sky, the kind of sky that seemed to press down on everything beneath it. She awoke early, her body stiff from a night spent tossing and turning, her mind unable to silence the endless loop of worry and half-formed plans. Her stomach twisted in knots, a familiar ache that had long since become part of her. But it was not for herself that she feared. It was for him, for the boy still sleeping peacefully under the tattered blanket, oblivious to the quiet war being waged on his behalf. She dressed quickly, pulling on the same clothes from the day before, the fabric stiff and cold against her skin. In the kitchen, she scoured every corner, every shelf, hoping for something she might have missed. But there was nothing. Not a crumb, not a coin. She leaned against the counter, the weight of failure crushing her chest, and closed her eyes tightly against the tears that threatened to spill. There was no time for that now. She had to move. She had to keep going. When she woke her son, she did it with the same smile she wore like a shield, bright and steady. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and asked if there would be pancakes today, remembering the Saturdays when somehow she had made miracles out of flour and water and a little imagination. She tousled his hair and told him not today, but maybe soon, maybe very soon. He accepted her words without question because he trusted her, because he believed she could make anything happen. She carried that trust like a burden heavier than any hunger, heavier than any shame. They stepped outside into the brittle morning air, the wind sharp and unkind. She had no real destination in mind, no plan beyond movement itself. They walked because sitting still meant facing despair, and she was not ready to surrender to it. They walked past closed stores and boarded-up houses, past graffiti-stained walls and sagging telephone wires, past people who did not look at them, who did not see them. It was as if they were invisible, a mother and her son floating through the edges of a world that had no place for them. At the corner, she saw a small grocery store, and for a moment, hope flared painfully in her chest. Maybe there would be someone inside willing to offer a bruised apple, a broken loaf of bread. She pushed the door open, the bell overhead giving a reluctant jingle. The clerk behind the counter barely glanced up. She wandered the aisles slowly, pretending to shop, her eyes scanning for anything left forgotten, anything someone might have dropped or discarded. Her son trailed behind her, his small fingers brushing the shelves as he walked. Near the back, she found a basket marked clearance, filled with dented cans and torn boxes. She picked up a can of beans, the label half peeled, and turned it over in her hands. It cost more than she had. She set it back carefully, as if even touching it without buying it was somehow a theft. Her son looked up at her with a hopeful smile, and she shook her head gently. "Not today, baby," she whispered, and led him back outside. The day wore on, the hours stretching long and empty. They walked through streets she barely recognized, farther from home than she intended, her legs aching, her throat dry. Her son grew quieter, his energy flagging, but he did not complain. Every so often he would ask if they were going somewhere special, and she would tell him yes. They were on an adventure. It was a lie, a small mercy she could offer him in place of the things he truly needed. At a park bench, they sat for a while, the boy resting his head against her side. She stroked his hair absently, her mind racing. She thought about the food bank across town, but it was closed on weekends. She thought about the church, but she had already asked for help once that month, and the shame of being turned away again was too much to bear. She thought about knocking on doors, but the memory of the school, of the principal's cold eyes, kept her frozen in place. As they sat there, a group of children played nearby, their laughter bright and sharp. One of the mothers, wrapped in a warm coat with a coffee cup in hand, glanced at her for a moment, then quickly looked away. The mother on the bench felt the sting of that look, the quick dismissal, the silent judgment. She pulled her son closer and kissed the top of his head, anchoring herself to him, to the only thing that mattered. When the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting everything in a pale, sickly light, she knew they had to start back. The walk home felt endless. Her son's steps grew slower, his small body drooping with exhaustion. She lifted him into her arms, even though her own body screamed in protest, and carried him the last few blocks. She pressed her face against his hair, breathing in the scent of him, grounding herself against the hunger and the cold and the fear. By the time they reached their building, the streets were nearly empty, the windows glowing warmly against the deepening dark. She fumbled with the key, her fingers numb, and finally pushed the door open. Inside, the apartment was as cold and silent as they had left it. She set her son down gently on the couch, covering him with the thin blanket, and sat beside him, feeling the crushing weight of the day settle into her bones. She did not know how they would eat tomorrow. She did not know what she would say when he asked again. But for now, she was here. He was here. They had survived another day, and sometimes in the quiet spaces between despair and hope, survival was enough. Night had settled over the city like a heavy blanket, thick and suffocating. Inside the small apartment, the chill had deepened, seeping through the thin walls and into her very bones. She sat by the window, long after her son had drifted off to sleep, wrapped in his blanket on the couch. She could hear his soft breathing, rhythmic and peaceful, and it was both a comfort and a cruel reminder. She had kept him alive for another day, but she was running out of ways to pretend she could keep doing it. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the distant glow of streetlights blur into smudges of gold. Her body ached with exhaustion, her head throbbed from the relentless emptiness in her stomach, but it was the weight inside her chest that threatened to undo her completely. For weeks, she had pushed herself beyond what she thought possible, clinging to hope by the thinnest of threads. Now that thread was fraying fast and she could feel herself slipping. In the darkness of the kitchen, she moved with slow, deliberate steps. She opened the cupboards again, opened the fridge again, even knowing there was nothing new inside. It was a cruel ritual, a form of self-torture she could not seem to stop. Her hands trembled as she searched, not for food anymore, but for anything at all that she could turn into a meal. And then, tucked behind an empty box, she found it, a forgotten bag of flour, half open and nearly empty, but still there, still something. She stared at it for a long moment, feeling a surge of desperate hope ignite in her chest. It was ridiculous, the way her heart leapt at the sight of such a small, meager thing. But when you had nothing, even the smallest thing could feel like salvation. She poured what little was left into a bowl, added a splash of water from the tap, and stirred it together with shaking hands. It formed a sticky, unappetizing paste, but it was better than nothing. It was something to give him, something to make him believe, if only for a moment, that she could still take care of him. As she worked, the dizziness she had been fighting all day crept up on her with brutal force. Her head swam, her knees buckled, and before she could catch herself, she collapsed onto the cold kitchen floor. The bowl clattered out of her hands, the paste splattering against the tiles. She lay there, gasping, the world tilting wildly around her. Her body was spent, utterly emptied out, a vessel drained of every last reserve. For a long moment she could not move. She could barely think. She was distantly aware of the hard floor against her cheek, the cold sinking into her skin. She thought of her son sleeping just a few feet away, oblivious to the fact that his mother was crumpled and broken just beyond his sight. She thought of the days ahead, the endless stretch of hunger and fear and uncertainty. She thought of the woman at the school, the ones who had looked through her like she was invisible, like she was already gone. Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes, not loud, not violent, just a slow, steady betrayal of everything she had tried to hold back. She cried because she was tired, because she was scared, because there was no clear path forward anymore, only a fog of exhaustion and despair. She had given everything she had, and it still wasn't enough. Love was not enough to fill a stomach. Hope was not enough to heat a home. Strength was not enough to bend a world that had already decided she did not matter. She closed her eyes and let herself lie there, motionless, surrendering for just a moment to the darkness inside her. There was a certain peace in giving up, in letting go of the endless struggle, the endless pretending. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to stop fighting, to just be a broken woman on a kitchen floor, with no one to witness her collapse, no one to judge it, no one to save her from it. But then, through the fog of her mind, she felt a small hand touch her face. She opened her eyes slowly to find her son kneeling beside her, his face pale with worry, his eyes wide and glistening. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice trembling, "are you sick?" He brushed her hair back with a gentleness that shattered what little resolve she had left. She forced herself to sit up, every muscle protesting, and pulled him into her arms. She held him tightly, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her chest, grounding her, anchoring her to something real and good. She could not fall apart. Not yet. Not while he still needed her. She kissed the top of his head, breathing in the familiar scent of him, and whispered into his hair, "I'm okay, baby. Mommy's just a little tired." He nodded solemnly, accepting her words the way only a child could, with absolute trust. He reached over and picked up the bowl she had dropped, scooping some of the flour paste with his fingers and holding it out to her. "We can share, Mommy," he said simply. Tears filled her eyes again, but this time she did not let them fall. She smiled instead, a real smile, small and shaky, but real, and took a bite from his hand. It tasted terrible, gritty, and raw, but she chewed and swallowed and smiled at him again, because he needed her to be strong, because she was the only thing he had, because even in the wreckage of everything else, the love between them remained fierce and bright and indestructible. She helped him back to the couch, covering him again with the thin blanket, and sat beside him, her body aching, her soul heavier than ever. She stared out the window into the endless night, knowing that tomorrow would come, whether she was ready or not. Knowing that somehow she would have to find a way to rise again, for him, always for him. Morning arrived slowly with a faint grayness that blurred the line between night and day. She had not really slept. Instead, she drifted in and out of restless dozes, waking at every small sound, her mind spinning with everything she could not fix. Her body felt like it belonged to someone else, heavy and unresponsive, but beside her, her son slept peacefully, his small face soft and calm. Watching him gave her the strength she no longer found anywhere else. She rose carefully, unwilling to disturb him, and moved through the apartment with deliberate slowness. The air was colder this morning. It clung to her skin, made every breath feel thin and sharp. She wrapped herself in her worn sweater and stared again at the empty kitchen, at the cracked tiles and peeling paint, at the barren counters where there should have been food, where once upon a time there had been meals and laughter and light. She pressed her palm flat against the counter, grounding herself against the rising tide of fear. She had nothing left to give him for breakfast. No flour, no water, not even a crumb. She closed her eyes and leaned heavily against the cabinet, her shoulders shaking from the silent effort of holding herself together. She had promised him there would be something. She had promised him tomorrow would be better. Now tomorrow had arrived, and she had nothing. But breaking in front of him was not an option. Despair was a luxury she could not afford. When her son awoke, he stretched with a sleepy smile and asked, as he always did, what they would eat today. She crouched down to his level, brushed the hair from his forehead, and said, "First, we're going on a little walk." His face lit up at the idea of an adventure, and he jumped up, ready to follow her anywhere. She bundled him in his too thin jacket and pulled her scarf tight against her throat. They stepped out into the cold morning air together, hand in hand, two small figures moving through a world that barely noticed them. They walked without a destination. She only knew she could not sit in that apartment another hour, could not. Watch her son's face fall when he realized there was nothing to eat. She told him stories as they walked, silly little tales she made up on the spot about brave knights and magical forests and hidden treasures. He laughed, his breath puffing out in small white clouds, and for a moment the weight on her shoulders lifted. For a moment they were just a mother and her son walking through the cold together, dreaming. As they passed by a row of shops, she noticed a small bakery she had never really paid attention to before. The windows were fogged with warmth, and the smell of fresh bread curled through the air like a beckoning hand. She stopped without meaning to, standing there on the sidewalk, her stomach clenching painfully at the scent. She could not afford to go inside. She knew that, but she could not bring herself to walk away either. Her son tugged at her sleeve, looking up at her with wide, hopeful eyes. "Mommy, it smells so good," he whispered. She nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in her throat. "It does, sweetheart," she said. She turned to lead him away, but just as she did, the door of the bakery swung open, and a man stepped out, holding a tray piled high with loaves that looked slightly misshapen or overly browned. He was middle-aged, his apron dusted with flour, his face lined not with hardness, but with tired kindness. He caught her looking and hesitated. Then, without a word, he smiled and held out one of the loaves. "Extras," he said simply. "We were just going to throw them out." She stared at him, for a moment unable to speak, the generosity hitting her harder than any cruelty ever had. She stepped forward slowly, accepting the warm loaf with both hands. The heat of it sank into her frozen fingers, and something inside her cracked open. "Thank you," she managed to whisper, her voice thick with emotion. The man only nodded, already, turning back inside as if he did not realize he had just saved something more important than a day. She crouched down and tore off a piece of the bread, handing it to her son. His face lit up with pure, innocent joy as he bit into it, and she watched him chew happily, crumbs scattering across his jacket as if it were a feast fit for kings. They sat together on the curb outside the bakery, sharing the warm, misshapen loaf between them. Each bite tasted better than anything she had ever eaten in her life, not because it was rich or fancy, but because it was enough. It was enough for today. She wrapped what remained carefully in a napkin, saving it for later, knowing how precious every crumb was. The sky began to clear overhead, the heavy clouds lifting just enough to let a pale sun break through. She tilted her head back and let the weak sunlight touch her face, closing her eyes for a brief, fleeting moment of peace. She knew this loaf of bread would not solve everything. She knew tomorrow would bring the same battles, the same fears, the same endless struggle. But for today they had this small mercy. For today they were fed. They were together. They had survived. When they finally stood up to go, her son slipped his hand into hers, his small fingers fitting perfectly between hers. "I love you, Mommy," he said, his voice bright and full of absolute certainty. She squeezed his hand tightly, feeling the warmth of him, the life of him, anchoring her once more. "I love you more," she whispered back. And as they walked home together under the pale, uncertain sun, she realized that the world could close its doors, could turn its face away, could take almost everything from them. But it could not take this. It could not take the fierce, quiet love that burned between them, a light that still shone even in the deepest darkness.